Great. So, earlier you all were talking about food, so I'll just add my son is an ultra hiker. He uses things like I only went 40 miles today on a hike. And so he calculates his caloric needs very diligently on those hikes. And so when you ask him what he had for dinner, it's often things like I mix tuna with peanut butter and M&Ms because he does not care one about flavor. It is all about replacing his protein and calories. And one more reason why he and I don't go on hikes together. So I'm going to switch over to my slide deck here. And I think we got it working earlier, so hopefully we won't have any trouble with that. And maybe somebody give me another thumbs up that you're able to see my slide okay. Is that perfect? Okay. And I'll be watching. I'm going to violate all the speech coach things about body language. I'm watching 3 different screens, and it is quite possible I'll miss a chat. So if I do, if somebody can wave me down, I definitely would like to answer questions as we go, and plenty of time at the end. So I am Larry Warren. I'm the director of the Oregon State Marine Board. I've been here for a little over 2 years. I've been with state government for 20. I've been just about everywhere, and every different type of agency, everywhere from Department of Revenue, state parks, even human services for a while. And Marine Board was somewhere I wanted to be because I am a boater. Grew up mostly drift boats, canoes, fishing the ocean with my grandfather, and just all over Oregon, a lifelong Oregonian. Currently, if you find me on a weekend, I'm almost always at Newport with my family. That's my daughter down there in that screen, violating everything I've taught her about reeling in a fish, but she likes that picture. That's our current boat there, and we keep it down in Newport and do a lot of ocean fishing. When we're not doing that, we do some flat water paddling. Got several different kayaks, canoes, but we're all very tame, flat water folk. But we do get out from time to time in our kayaks, and I particularly enjoy canoeing. So appreciate you all giving me some time today to talk about our agency and what we do. So for starters, we often like to think that we're one of the most misunderstood agencies. So a lot of folks don't really know what Marine Board does. Some people think we recruit Marines. Some people think we're only saltwater focused. And quite honestly, Marine Board's somewhat of an unfortunate name that was developed in 1959. And the logistics of changing an agency name are so horrific, our lawyers have told us not to ever try. So we're stuck with the Marine Board, and it just encompasses so much, and that's something we're trying to get better about talking about. So the easiest way to think about our agency is we're a resource to Oregon boaters, and we're a resource to the people that serve Oregon boaters. So I'll talk a little bit about that and what we do. We've got a 5-member board, governor appointed, Senate confirmed, and we don't have any specifics that say it's got to be somebody from the east and somebody from the west and somebody that does that like some boards, but we try to maintain balance. We try to have different boating types. We try to have different geographic areas represented, different genders, just try to get everything represented in 5 people. Almost impossible to do, but we do our best. The board member that would probably best serve an organization like OOPS on our board right now would be Laura Jackson. She's an active paddler in the Portland area community. And I know if you ever had issues, she'd be more than welcome to have you reach out to her, and I could always help you do that. We've got 39 staff. I think oftentimes when we talk about all that we do, people think we have hundreds of people. I've got 39 dedicated people that just work tirelessly. I mean, even while I've been sitting here, I've watched some of them coming back from being on the road all day and doing their work, and just really dedicated to Oregon boaters. So we take care of boating safety, which is sort of a broad area. We contract with 32 of the 36 sheriffs in the state to do marine patrol. They're out on the water helping to keep people safe and doing boating patrols. 4 counties don't have enough water to warrant a marine patrol. It's not that we don't like those 4 counties. It's just, believe it or not, Oregon has 4 counties without any real water in it. We train the marine patrol folks how to maneuver boats, how to understand boating laws. And so we oversee that area. They get their police training through their normal channels for police training. We're just training them on the boat aspect. All the boater education, Oregon navigational aids, that all happens under boating safety. So no wake buoys. We don't do some of the work. Obviously, the Coast Guard places the big navigational buoys you see around, but we work with channel markers and no wake buoys, and all that's happening in our boating safety program that has, I think, 6 or 7 people in it. And then we do facilities. So if you've used a public boat ramp in the state, you can almost assure that you're using a facility that we've granted money to help build. So that's how we help with facilities. We give money to public facilities to build and maintain their boat ramps all across the state. And with that, we have a team of 3 engineers who specialize in developing boating facilities. And so it's more cost effective for us to have those folks on staff, so that as we grant money to projects all around the state, we don't have to contract for engineering services in each one of those jurisdictions. So our engineers are all over the state all the time working with ports and parks and public facility providers to help them design and maintain their facilities. So that's a big piece of what we do. And then our registrations program is out there. So we register the boats. In the case of non-motorized boats, we sell you a waterway access permit, which we'll talk about later. And that is 6 or 7 folks that help register 160,000 boats. And then just because we're government and we like to keep things confusing, if you have a boat trailer, that goes through the DMV. That's not something that we do here. So, but our registration function, very important for our revenue sources. A really big one that often gets overlooked as part of our mission, and we do this in partnership with Fish and Wildlife, is aquatic invasive species prevention. And if you're not really familiar with aquatic invasive species and the problems they can cause, I'd suggest after the meeting, Google mussels, Great Lakes, and just watch as you see how damaging these are to infrastructures, not just boating, but public infrastructures, sewers, electrical, all of the things that run through water. And you think about a state like Oregon that relies so heavily on our hydropower, and you start to get a feel for how bad some of these things could be if they make their way into the Northwest. So we work with ODFW to run check stations all across the state. We do different things just through rules and education and outreach to try to help prevent it. I often say it's a lot like public health, and that, you know, we're spending as much money as we can to try to help prevent it. It will eventually probably make its way to the Northwest. Unfortunately, it does seem to be moving across the country. But we're doing everything we can to prevent it from coming in. And as an example, because one thing that we'll often hear is that, well, there's certainly kayak's not ever going to be a conduit for invasive species. And one of the big saves last year was at our check station in Ontario. We had some folks that had been kayaking at Lake Powell and had some of the really bad mussels that proliferate and destroy water bodies pretty quickly in their kayak, in the water in their kayak. And they were headed for the Deschutes River. That's where they were going to go launch. And luckily they were stopped and decontaminated, because that's a science experiment we don't want to see play out, is to see whether those would have taken hold in the Deschutes River. So certainly every boat type that can hold water can be a spreader of invasive species, but that is an area where we all share together in our different boating types. And then guides and outfitters, that's one where we go both land and sea. So if you're on a backpacking trip with a guide, if you're on a fishing trip with a guide, if you're on a climbing trip with a guide, a rafting trip, we license and regulate the guides and outfitters across the state. So it's a very important program for us to help keep the professional level as people go out with guides and outfitters. And then one of our other environmental programs is derelict vessels. And the piece I'd just say on this is, depending on where you're at in the state, derelict vessels really means a lot of different things. If we were at the coast having this conversation, we'd be talking about large commercial vessels that no longer have any economic value and they've been abandoned or sold for a few $100. If you're in the Portland area, it's often associated with some of the homeless issues and challenges and folks living on the river and different pieces like that. So it's kind of, we say derelict vessels, but depending on where we're at in the state, it has quite a variety of challenges associated with it. So this is an area where we get a lot of interest. It's an area where we get asked a lot how we could do more. And it's one of those where you could infinitesimally spend on the problem and probably still not resolve it. I think right now, the biggest identified derelict vessel in the state is a former Navy boat that they sold online for $100, and it's estimated that it would cost over $3 million to remove it safely from the water. So it's a big problem that would take a lot of money to solve, but we're working on it. We work with state lands. We work with some different organizations in Portland and at the coast. And it's just something that we're all still trying to find the right approach to deal with. So really important. So those are kind of the high level of what our agency does. And again, I always like to remind folks that's with 39 staff, and there's things that fall underneath each one of those have different grant programs and priorities and programs. So folks really stay busy out there. So one of the things that I've heard might be of interest is just kind of what are some current boating policy trends out there? And I've lived in Oregon long enough that if you ask me how many people live here, I still say like 2.5 million people. And I'm told I'm already wrong by about 1 million. And then everybody says in the next 10 years, we have another 1 million people coming to Oregon or being born here and then adding to our population. And really, when we think about boating right now in our state, we've sort of enjoyed this luxury of we actually are not nearly as congested as, say, some of our Northeast counterparts, some of our Great Lake counterparts, certainly not some of the water bodies in the Texas and the Arizonas and some of those. And yet when we see another 1 million people coming to our state, and we're already starting to see and feel congestion issues, particularly in the Portland area, but that's expanding out in more places. Folks come to Oregon because they love the outdoors, so we hope they want to get outdoors. But we're having to already start to plan for how are we going to deal with that increased usage in the future? What are we going to do as boating policy and try to help disperse that use? One of the other big trends in boating policy is the responding to the changes in water use. So, you know, non-motorized use is exploding. Power boats are actually trending bigger right now. Power plants are changing. Boat designs are changing. Fine example of this on the motorized side is pontoon boats all of a sudden have gotten really, really popular. And there's an example where from a boating policy perspective, one, pontoon boats require a few little different things at boating facilities. And two, is a generalization, but from a boating administration side, you tend to see more alcohol related issues with pontoon boats when we look at other states and their use. And so that's an area where we get a change in the water use and we have to start planning for that. And then again, certainly the just explosion in non-motorized use is certainly one that everybody is working on the boating policy. And then kind of with those two items comes the what does sharing our waterways mean? And that's one of the areas that we constantly are working on in our boating policy. So, you know, everybody comes to the water and they want to play and they want to use things. And we hear that word all the time. Well, we should just share the water. We should just do this. But when we have different groups coming in and they want different experiences and they want to do different things and those things collide, then folks tend to look at us for policy related decisions. Now with that said, it varies even across our state, right? So when you go to the east side of the state, again, generalization, they don't tend to want as many rules as, say, more of the valley and the coastal side of the state. So as we approach some of these issues about changing water use and sharing our waterways, even across our state, there's different ways that the local communities like to deal with some of those challenges. So we're faced with those on a very routine basis. I heard, I can't remember her name, so I apologize, but somebody was talking that they'd done over 100 whitewater trips this year. That's pretty cool. And that community often tells government that we don't do a very good job of assessing risk, or that more correctly, we're too risk adverse. So one of the things that we always are looking at in our boating policy is, when are we being too obtrusive into somebody's life to what we would say is keeping them safe, versus allowing somebody to make a choice about something that's good for their personal well-being. So when I was touring the Umpqua the other day and they showed me some area looking and they called it Dead Man something, and it was a class 4 something or the other. And I thought, boy, that looks really dangerous. But one of the folks on the tour with me said, well, it would be for you, but for me, I could run that very easily because I've done it. I'm experienced. I know how to do it, and I can do it safely. So we're constantly tugging and pushing around, balancing safety with that personal choice and opportunity out there in boating. So that's one I think that builds on all the other themes as well. And then, I already hit on it, but I'll hit it again, is the invasive species prevention is an interesting one. It's got a lot of legislative interest. It's one of the rare programs we have where legislators are asking us, how can we give you more money to try to help you with this problem? Particularly our coastal legislators just seem to be very keenly aware of the challenges that are associated with the invasive species. And they're wanting to make sure that Oregon is well-versed and ready to try to prevent them from coming in and then handle them if they're in the water. So that's a policy area. You'll see this last year, for instance, we got a law passed that said when you transport a boat over land, you have to pull the drain plug. That's an area where we tried to solve that with some boating policy and boating laws, actually. And the idea there is if you pull your plug when you're transporting over land, then the water drains out of your bilge and it increases the likelihood that the invasive species die en route to the next water body that you may go launch at. And so that's an area where we get pushed a lot by the legislator to really continue to think about. And then this one, serving paddlers, is really nationwide. If you go to a national boating safety conference, NASBLA is a national organization that boating administrators all participate in. There's two camps, right? Some of them are still sort of in the, what are we going to do about these paddlers? And then there's a growing movement, I would say, at the national level of, well, wait a minute, how are we going to serve these paddlers? And so when we're looking at the national levels and the local level, both, as we think about our policy, it's how do we help integrate this explosion in non-motorized use and the different types of non-motorized use? I think that's important to recognize as well. How do we help integrate that safely into our waters and try to balance everybody's needs and bring paddlers in? So we'll talk later about the waterway access and some of the work that we're doing on that. So those are really the big policy trend areas that we see. When I think about what the board's usually being asked to address, things that they're being asked to look at, they all usually fall somewhere up under here. And I don't know that anyone jumps out as a top issue for me, because they tend to blend and build on each other. And the more complex issues tend to have pieces of all of those. Even the invasive species, it pops up in some of the policy issues that wouldn't necessarily jump out as correlating to some of those others. So those are the big policy areas that we're looking at. And then one of the things that was asked was, what do our facilities of the future look like? So we talk a lot about mixed use now. So you can see there, those rails are actually purpose built for what that gentleman's doing with those. He's properly using that slide, and the person walking up the stairs is probably thinking that rail is too low and what person built such a low rail. But mixed use can be motorized, non-motorized, all coming together. And then and at the same time, it can also be facilities where maybe, like right now, duck hunters are going to start hitting the water using different facilities that maybe a month ago paddlers were using. And then in the spring, it might be some spring Chinook fishermen, and then start the cycle all over again. The nice thing about mixed use is we share infrastructure costs. It is expensive to build public facilities. So we can find opportunities to get a whole lot of people's money involved into building those. It's a good thing. It makes it cheaper and better for everybody. Facilities for the future, protecting public access. If you were to ask me what I think the best thing a Marine Board has done since its creation in 1959, I would say go to Boat Oregon and look at the boat access map. That is public access that has been preserved since 1959 throughout different projects in the state for boaters. And it is remarkable how often public's access to the water is eroded in small ways and challenged in small ways, and it all builds up. And if you were to ask me personally, what probably concerns me the most about just the Marine Board, it would be this idea of protecting our public boating access. Because what worries me is facility providers can't afford their maintenance. If they can't afford to provide the access, if they can't maintain it at a safe level, it's either going to get sold or it's going to get put into private lease, or access is going to be shut down. The other thing we often see is there's only so many places that we can all go put our kayaks, canoes, and power boats in the water. So when those get turned into things that aren't boating related, it's just one more place we can't take our boat and go use that. And so when I think ahead, if we don't protect public access, we won't be fighting about how we use the water because none of us will be able to get to the water. And that's just an area I think folks, the more they learn about that and the more they engage in that, they find that that is a really important piece. And there's some groups all across the state doing good work on that, but very important. The other piece on facilities on the future is permits aren't getting cheaper. So we've got, nowadays, I think we say before we ever put a shovel in the ground, we can easily be up to $50,000 in DEQ permits, cultural assessments, lands, Army Corps, hydro studies, it just local permits. And so when we look at our facilities, we often hear, well, just throw some gravel down, make it easy, just skid it out. Well, first off, we'd love to be able to do that, but we've got to go through a whole lot of permits and they're a whole lot of expense. And that's not going to get easier or cheaper in the future. An example is right now, we're working on a facility design on the ILC. And one of the hangups is one of the environmental groups is holding the permit because the bathroom would be in a floodplain. And we're trying to explain to them that every boat ramp, by the nature of being near the water, would be in a floodplain generally. And so what can we do about that? With that, though, I want to put in the plug that permits, I don't see them as bad. I just see them as something that we all have to acknowledge exists, because usually what we're trying to do is integrate environmental and cultural protections into our facility designs. And so a good example, if you go to one of our concrete boat ramps and you see that grooved concrete that hurts your feet if you walk on it barefoot or stocking footed, that serves an environmental purpose. It actually stops the oil and runs it down to a bioswale so it doesn't just run straight into the river. When we plan our parking, we're planning bioswales, and we're looking for ways to get the drainage to run right. And cultural in Oregon, we have 9 recognized Oregon tribes. They're an important entities in our state. And if you are near water, there is a good chance that there is something that's culturally significant to a tribe. And we value that a lot at the Marine Board, and that we want to make sure that when we do a public facility, that we don't do something that's disrespectful to their cultural items. And so we go through all sorts of archaeology studies. We go through just working with the tribes on how to handle and progress as we work on different facility sites. So those permits not getting easier and cheaper, don't think of that as a bad thing. Think of it as it's serving the environmental and cultural pieces. And it's just a reality of what we've got as we go forward. Folks that did this 30 years ago would just take a backhoe and go to work. And unfortunately, at times they damaged some very cultural significant things and did some environmental damage. So when we look at our facilities of the future, this is what we have in our mind: the mixed use, protecting our public access, and really trying to integrate things like these just simple things with the kayak carry down. And I've got a few more examples of that as well. So now is a great time for y'all to be talking with us, and I was excited to get the invite. I would say if you've been around Oregon for a while, Marine Board definitely has a long and tenuous history at times with the non-motorized community, the paddling communities. I think at the height in the 80s, at one point, a bunch of rafters actually brought their rafts and blocked the Capitol because they were mad at the Marine Board. And the Marine Board sort of just went away for 15, 20 years, took a very adversarial type stance against non-motorized boating. And one of the things that I really appreciate is my predecessor recognized that if we were going to even begin to start building trust and credibility in the non-motorized community, that we would have to start doing something. We couldn't just take this adversarial handoff stance. So I think actually they didn't necessarily sing their praise enough about some of the work they did and just preparation for showing the paddling community that we were ready to behave differently. So I just want to show a few of those things that led up to the waterway access permit that started this year. So here's an example where this one I think was 6 years ago, when the agency decided to change its posture about how to serve non-motorized versus this kind of standoffish approach. They went into the and this one's always a tough one for me, I apologize, the Oyala boat slide on the Siletz. And put in some single car parking, put in a restroom, put in this really cool slide that you probably can't see very well, but it helps get canoes and drift boats and any other boat on down to the river. This is another great example of what was happening before was people were just dragging their stuff down there or using winches or all sorts of things, creating muddy banks, destroying the riparian habitat, all sorts of really bad things. But now it's a great site. People can go there and use it. Another example, here's a good one that just, simple, right? Is Port of Arlington windsurfing. Now, of course, I look at this and think, well, we're in the Columbia, so Army Corps probably had some thoughts about it, and there was certainly probably some work with the tribes on it. But again, serving that non-motorized community is a first step to trying to build some of that trust back up. Here's one that I would think that some of you may have been around, just thinking about where all you are mostly located, and that's the Cedar Oak Willamette River. This one's great. You almost can't even see that it's there. It's a nice little carry down to an area where you can put a kayak in or canoe. And we did some riparian buffer area in that. It helped with the parking, and it also helped with the carry down to do some of that riparian buffer. So those are some examples of projects that we did. And then the other one that we see come up quite a bit is this ADA kayak launch. And, this is a work in progress in terms of what we're going to do here. One of the things that we talk about in the state is when we do something for disabled boaters, we do something good for everybody. If it's easier for a disabled person to access a site, it's probably easier for me to access the site as well. And the posture we should be taking is, why wouldn't we want to serve different communities that way? So there's a lot of companies that are trying different variations of these ADA kayak launches. I like them because I don't have to get my feet wet when I put my canoe in the water when I use them. But they're not a perfect solution yet. It's definitely a work in progress. We haven't found one that we particularly think is working 100% well, but we do have a board member that happens to be a wheelchair bound boater, and he is doing a lot of work with us to help grow that. But it's an area we've put money in and invested to try to make it better for people. So we did that work, and then we came along and we asked for what's being called the Waterway Access Permit. And I hope at least some of you are familiar with that. It used to just be an AIS permit, an aquatic invasive species permit, and it applied to non-motorized boats that were 10 foot and over. And so came along, we said, well, we can make one permit so folks don't have to buy an AIS permit and a waterway access permit. And we can do the accounting on the back end, so we'll still transfer the money to the AIS program. And we'll start a new grant program to serve non-motorized boaters. And that distrust crept back up in a lot of those conversations. People were worried we were going to take the money and spend it on everything. And so we just said, okay, let's write the legislation so we can't. And so that legislation is written very tight. The only thing we can do is transfer the appropriate amount of money to the invasive species program and run the grant program. And the only staff member we added out of that was an engineering staff. And that's just based off our experience in other grant programs. If we didn't add that engineering staff, every single one of these programs would require a contracted engineering service, and it would cost far more than what the state pays engineers. And so we just know from our motorized experience, we can do that cheaper. And so started in January 2020, we sold 56,000 permits. We put 890,000 into the Waterway Access Fund, and we put 418,000 in the Invasive Species Fund. And then we've already had our first grant round in August 2020. And we gave away $450,000. And these are just some examples of things that we did. That Arlington facility I showed you, we helped continue to build that up with some flush restrooms, some showers, expanded parking. Showers are an example of something most motorized boaters don't care about, showers and changing rooms. A lot of non-motorized boaters do like changing rooms and showers. It just makes it nice when you don't have to change in some of those public outhouses and different things. So that's an area where you'll see things like showers and changing rooms. Port of Alsea, we did add a kayak dock on a piece they were doing. And then if you haven't been down to the city of Reedsport, boy, I really suggest everybody go down there. They're doing some cool things at Rainbow Plaza, neat little community, totally jazzed about serving boaters. And they had this little piece of property that kayakers had already been using, but it wasn't owned in public trust. It was private land. And it came for sale, and we were able to help them purchase that. And that's 50 years now that people are going to be able to go use that site, minimum of 50 years. People will be able to go use that site and have public access. And then Vive Northwest came along and they're going to help us do some multilingual boating and water safety videos. So really there was a few other ones in there, and those were some real highlights of really just excited about some of the projects that we had across the state. You'd be surprised how hard it is to start a program and give money away in 9 months, but we did it. It took a lot of work on staff and a lot of work on facility providers. And I'm pretty excited about that work. The other piece that's coming out of that is a whole lot of technical assistance. And that's our engineers. When somebody says, gee, I think I need a non-motorized something here. I want to serve a kayaker here, but I don't know how. What are other people doing? We send our engineer out and they just kind of do a 1,000,000-foot level view of like, well, you're going to have to do some wetland mitigation, and here's some ideas of some docks that have worked at this place and some different access things that have worked at this place. So we have done more technical assistance than we ever thought, but it confirms what we know, which is this grant program, as it comes up to speed, will be oversubscribed. The needs to serve non-motorized boaters across the state is huge, and we'll get after it and serve it with the Waterway access funds. But we just know that as projects come up, like every other grant program in the state, we'll never have enough money to serve all the needs. And then the reason I think, yeah.
We just have a quick question here.
Yeah.
Does all the waterway access permit money stay within the Marine Board for AIS and Washington, WA?
So just make sure I've got that. Does all the money stay in the Marine Board for the invasive?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So the grant money, if in an accounting term, you'd almost think of us like a pass-through. It comes in and then we grant the money out. So that money has actually been granted to the Port of Arlington, the Port of LC, the City of Reedsport, and Vive Northwest. So it comes into us. Our board makes votes on how to award the grants. We actually sought public input on that. We don't do that normally for our grant programs. And it went really well. So it's something we're going to do in more grant programs. And so all that money will come to us in the program, and then we grant it out to those public facility providers. And our grant terms require that they maintain it and provide public access to it for 20 years if it's stuff, and 50 years if it's a property acquisition.
Is there a required match on those grants?
So we don't have a required match, but you score a lot better if you have match. And if I think about these projects, usually we see about a 25 to 50% match. I think on some of these, like the City of Reedsport, if I remember, and this is off the top of my head, like I think that was one they just didn't have much match, and it was such a good deal to grab a hold of some property like that. Their match might have been a little lower, but so we don't have a required match, but you generally score better if you do get some match. And the folks that run these facilities, they're looking for match money from just about everybody they can. They're good at that piece. And then the invasive species money, we largely use, we contract with Fish and Wildlife to run those check stations. And then we do the education and the outreach. So the money is either used through Marine Board to fund that education and outreach, or it's used as a contract with ODFW to run the invasive species check stations around the state. So that's how that money goes. But yes, thank you for that question. So the future of the program, I like to say it took us 60 years to build the motorized programs. I hope, we learned some things along the way, and we're seeing some of that and already being able to do some of these exciting grant projects and get the money out there. But we've been very clear with the legislator. We've been clear as we can every time we've talked about this. We want to build this program with the non-motorized to serve them. So things that we get asked about, just for example, is, well, are you guys going to require education? Believe it or not, education is really not popular. And my response on that is always, well, at some point it might be a good discussion with the paddling communities, but I don't think that we need to build the education the same way we build it for motorized. We know from data and studies and surveys that paddlers by and large do a lot better with their safety if they join an organization like OOPS, because you guys probably have safety officers, you probably have people that think about safety, teach safety, years of boating experience, and you're going to do a lot more for them than having them take some online test that they just barrel through to get through. So maybe there's an opportunity to work with paddling clubs around that type of outreach. We also know that outside of paddling clubs, the second place that people get their safety is just from a friend, right? So versus motorized boats, you get, for whatever reason, people that buy them without experience and don't seek someone out with experience to go get that. So their education program probably, it looks different. So we have no plans to ask for any required education, but that's something that as we go forward over the next 4 to 8 years, we'll be talking with the non-motorized community paddlers saying, what does it look like in your world? How do we help people? Right now in our state, non-motorized fatalities have been higher than motorized fatalities. I think we're on our 4th year in a row at least for that. And data says that education helps stop fatalities. But again, it doesn't need to look just like we're doing with the motorized. So that's something we'll be talking with paddlers about. What do we do? How do we help in this? And then the other one that comes up a lot of times is just law enforcement. We provided no extra funding to our law enforcement people out of this. And we've been very clear with those contracts that they don't need to worry about where the money comes from. They should serve everybody out on the water, and that we believe their funding is adequately supported through other means. But with that said, we've thought about maybe, again, things don't need to necessarily look exactly like what we're doing them today. Is there room maybe in the future to find funding for park rangers with some minimal citation authority? Maybe that makes more sense, because we could find people that could get out on the water in kayaks, in canoes, and get in the places that folks go and help educate and take more of that park ranger type approach. Maybe that's what enforcement looks like in the paddling community. We don't know. Those are the things that we want to grow, again, over the next 4 to 10 years. Our 4 to 6 year vision is to keep delivering on this grant program to show paddlers that we're serious about using this money for things that serve you, and then talking with you about where this goes next, not us coming to the table and just keep ask. We have no short-term asks in terms of increasing fees or changing fees. Our goal for 4 to 6 years is to deliver the grant program and to hear from organizations like you and people like you about what do you think it needs next. So from that perspective, I think it's a great time for organizations like OOPS to invite Marine Board in and to open those conversations up. So I appreciate that timing. And then running just a little longer than I thought I would, but this is my last slide here. What does every boat administrator wish paddlers knew? Again, back to that national level, we definitely, as boating administrators, recognize paddlers play a big part in our boating community, particularly in the Northwest, particularly in Oregon. And we want to have you be a part of that boating organization. We want to figure out how to serve you. It's on our mind all the time. It's talked about all the time. Everybody's trying to figure out how to best do it, and nationally, nobody seems to have arrived quite on how to do it. The next bullet, I almost pulled this out. It can be a little controversial. This is just a reminder that a lot of the infrastructure that we use as boaters have been paid for by people before us. So since 1959, boaters have been paying fees. They've been building infrastructure. They've been buying access. They've been doing all those great things. So just as a reminder that when we show up at a boating facility, it's somebody paved the way for that boating facility to be there. And that's where I think that waterway access is so exciting, is I think 2030, well, today we can all point who've bought that permit at the city of Reedsport and say, we've helped contribute to the public access and the things that are out there for people in future generations. The other one, this one comes up quite often actually. Social access points can damage habitat and cultural items. So a social access, and we describe that as sort of you just start dragging your boat down any old place. And if you do it enough times with enough people, you see riparian damage, you see mudslides created. We get, as recent as just a few weeks ago, I had another call from a tribe for an area that I won't disclose just because they're often sensitive about people knowing where their sensitive items are. But a large number of non-motorized boaters this summer, for whatever reason, started using this area. And the tribe was very concerned that they were having cultural items damaged and wanted to know what we could do about it. They also don't want us to broadcast where that's at. So that's one of the challenges we get when we work with some of the tribes. But that's why the tribes actually were supportive of the Waterway Access Program, by the way. That was one of those, we never thought about that when we brought that legislation forward. The tribes came forward and said, we see damages to our lands and our cultural significant items by people creating social access sites. So we're excited that you want to create structured access, so to speak. So I'm not saying that, especially I know like our whitewater communities and those, you know, you're not going to have nice structured access always to do what you're doing, but just be mindful of where you're taking your boats through and what you're doing and what you're dragging them across, and help your other folks think about that too. And then with the fire damage in all these areas, it's going to, you know, the riparian damage, the tree damage, we're just going to all have to be more mindful of this over the next 2 to 5 years as those areas recover and repair. This one, anybody can go down and buy a kayak for like $150 at Wilco Farm Store in Eastern Oregon and go be a kayaker. But they make a lot of really bad choices. Our safety concerns aren't usually with folks like you all that raise your hand when you say you got dry suits. And it's that low cost, which is what's so cool about paddling, is also what creates all sorts of safety issues. So if the more that you all can be ambassadors for us, the better. When I'm out in my powerboat, if I approach a group of paddlers and tell them what I think about how they're boating in a dangerous way, I don't usually get very far in that conversation, any more than you would get somewhere if you came up and tried to tell some powerboaters when you were on your kayak what you thought about how they were boating. But if I'm in my kayak and I slide up next to someone and say, hey, you know, if you put that life jacket on instead of sitting on it, you'd stand a chance of being alive if you fell off your kayak. You know, we can have those conversations. So we're really trying to promote the idea that people can become ambassadors for their community. So people like you all that are safety minded already, being willing to talk and approach these people. I'm sure you can spot them a mile away when you see those, and this is no disrespect to Costco kayaks or anything. When you see those, somebody that probably the stickers are still on the boat and their life jacket still has the tags on it, you know, have a conversation with them, pass on some of your knowledge, help keep your community safe. We'd all like to see less fatalities, less injuries across the state. And then just my final thought for the evening, and any questions for sure. You know, boaters are a diverse community. They're called to the water for a variety of reasons. And I'd like, you know, my utopic view is that we all find a way for boating to be an example of how that diversity makes our community flourish. I get worn down with us, them, paddler, motorized. I think there's more people that do a little bit of everything. So we've got some folks that just motorize, some people just paddle, and some that do everything. And if we could just stop for a moment and all recognize in our community, again, some of those points where we can come together around public access and public facilities and supporting safety, I think we'll get a lot further as a community. And boating's supposed to be fun. We remind ourselves that at work all the time because we're almost all boaters. And some days when all you're dealing with is the problems, you can forget that boating's supposed to be fun. And I just would implore everybody, to just help us make boating that example of how we all stop and help each other and look out for each other on the water. So appreciate your time. Apologize, I went a little longer than I thought I was going to, but I certainly have plenty of time for any questions that folks have. And
so Larry, we already have a question here. Is hosing your boat off inside and out adequate? Is there any scrubbing required? Is soap and water or bleach at all necessary?
Oh, great question. Yeah, you know, a good hose off is great. There's two things that really kill invasive species: hot water. So if you know, most of us don't have a steam station, unfortunately. Some states have mobile steam stations. And then just, we say clean, drain, dry. That's our message on that. So actually you're better if you give it a good rinse down and you dry it off, you're almost going to guarantee that those invasive species die by the time they get to the next time you launch. To give you an idea, in a wet kind of October, November, those things can last 1 to 2 weeks if you just kind of leave water puddled up inside your kayak and or your bilge of your boat. In the summer, we hear sometimes 6 to 20 hours depending on how hot it is outside. So really clean, drain, dry. Rinse it off. Soap and water's great, and then dry it off really good. And if you get it dried off, you'll know you're in good shape. And I know I have a lot of problems with that with my inflatable kayak. That thing, every time I think I have that's dry, I move it and I swear another gallon of water comes out of some fold or seam or something while I've got it. So if anybody's got tips on how to dry out an inflatable, I'd love to hear them. But yeah.
What's the best way to get more funding for the local Marine Patrol?
So we fund local Marine Patrol, not all of it. So for example, Multnomah County, I think we fund 5-ish positions, but then they fund 7 or 8 of their own because they have so much work on the water, right? And it's different in every community. Right now, Marine Patrol represents about 40% of my budget. So the only thing we would have to do would be able to take money out of our grant programs if we were going to increase. When we had those conversations around including some extra fee in that waterway access for the law enforcement, it was really interesting. There was certainly communities in the non-motorized side that were adamantly opposed and sharing that. And then other groups actually, while it was still going through the legislature, came and were asking, can we add a few more bucks onto each permit and dedicate that money to law enforcement? And our answer was, we're definitely not opposed to that. It would just be something tough for us to come back and ask for, 1 at the time and 2 so soon. And so that's an area where we would love to engage with the paddling community to see essentially how could we help bring some funding from maybe that side into the law enforcement piece.
Okay. Jennifer, I saw you had your hand up. Do you want to ask another question?
Yeah, I did. So that was actually my question. And I'm a member of Waterfront Organizations of Oregon because I'm a floating homeowner. We have a lot of paddlers in our neighborhood. We get these massive wakes and we just don't get enough patrols.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm asking, because it's a huge problem on North Portland Harbor.
Yeah, the amount of patrols are, they're a real challenge for sure. It's, and our Multnomah County folks, I always like to put a plug in for them because they do so much. I'm reminded every time I go out with them on a boat that they cover all the way up to Bonneville. They cover all the way up into right around Waverly, up into the Willamette. They cover down into the Multnomah Channel. And so, if they're dealing with an emergency up towards Bonneville, that's a lot of river miles where you are not going to see a patrol person during that emergency. So it is a challenge. It's a challenge for the funding. It's a challenge just even for them and all the different things that they deal with in a day. And it is an area where we are interested in always working with our law enforcement partners. One other piece to share, and I haven't heard this from Multnomah County, so I definitely don't want to attribute it to them, but I know some of our other counties, Clackamas, for example, have told us, even if we came up with more money, they're having a hard time filling positions right now. And so, giving them another 10,000 doesn't really help. We need to come up with another 200,000 so they could fund a full-time position to go hire somebody, as an example, right? So incrementally, if we don't come up with enough money for a sheriff's office to hire a body, if we don't have that kind of funding, a little extra money doesn't help them out very much, if that makes sense.
So Larry, what's your relationship with Willamette River Keepers and the Human Access Project in Portland?
So the Human Access Project, Willie, so when I think of that, I think of Willie Levinson, and if I'm off base on that, somebody let me know. And we meet with Willie. We've just done some work with him on the Duckworth Dock. He had a real nice idea about how to actually get people using that and swimming and still serving some non-motorized boaters and even some motorized boaters. And he worked through the board on getting that done and changing the grant terms so that could all be allowed. And it was a really nice deal. So we work with working with the Human Access Project on that. On Willamette River Keeper, you know, they've got their Willamette River Keeper Trail Guide is just out there on their websites, one everybody points to. We appreciate all the habitat work that they do, the restoration work that they do. Those things are all important. Oh, my screen just changed. I don't know why. So
I did that.
oh, okay, good. Hopefully, yeah. And so, you know, as an organization, we like that they're out there doing those restoration works and that they're working with the non-motorized communities and the things that they're trying to do. I don't know that we have any direct projects going on with them right now.
So are there any plans to use the triennial survey to get more input from paddlers about safety practices and usage of water bodies?
So we use the triennial surveys. We use a variety of surveys. We use the statewide, we use a lot of parks data, state parks data, sorry. And we use the triennial survey for some of those pieces when we look at kind of boating facilities and needs and thinking about our enforcement strategies and different pieces like that. So.
Okay. Don, I'm going to let you ask your question.
Is that me?
Yep, that's you.
Marine Board historically has been funded from powerboat registrations, if I'm correct, and that money has always stayed within the Marine Board. It's been an exemplary example. Is there a concern that funding from legislature could be accompanied by political influence?
So I guess I'm not, I apologize, Don, I'm not fully understanding. Are you talking about the Waterway Access Funds or are you talking?
I think more in general, that if the legislature's funding into the Marine Board, then does that become accompanied by politics?
Sure. So, you know, right now we're an agency that's really, we're self-funded. So in the budget world, they call us other funded. We do get money through the federal government through different grant programs and things that they have that are associated. We get fuel tax money that's rebated to us based on the number of motorized boats. But that is, like you kind of said, that's all our other fund money, and it stays inside of the Marine Board to grant out and do different things with. So if you're asking, so for instance, if we were to get a hold of general fund money, what happens in those situations where maybe, is that what you're kind of getting, if the legislator just started giving the agency general fund money? Yeah, I mean, really, as much as there's always political influence. I mean, we're a state agency and there's always different opinions on how things should be run. I think for me, more when I think about general fund type money, I don't worry as much about the political ties as I do. You become very subject to budget reduction exercises. So for example, in May, the agency was down, or the state was down a few billion. And then last week we found out now we're back up a few billion. Those general fund agencies all had to prepare, you know, massive cut packages. Some of them had to implement massive cut packages. Marine Board could continue to operate a little bit like a private business where we could say, our revenue right now is fairly stable. We're going to do some things to save some money to just make sure we're ready to weather a storm, but we don't need to go through those big cut packages. So I don't worry as much about the political influence as I do. You get into these general fund yo-yo up and down, cut, raise, add back, and the smaller piece of your pie is that, the harder it is to account for and deal with.
Good.
If I missed your question on that or didn't quite get there, just let me know. I'd be happy to.
No, that's good. Thank you.
Yeah. And then I saw somebody mention lottery funds as well. And having done some time at state parks, you know, lottery funds are great. Everybody sits around and thinks that they would like to have lottery funds. The challenge with that, if you sit in the parks perspective, not speaking for them for sure, is once you start getting lottery funds, everybody thinks you're rich, and then they start finding ways for you to spend the money. So for instance, you know, the state parks, when they started getting lottery funds, all of a sudden they were running the state fair. The state capitol became a park downtown, you know. So it's one of those, you some days dream about just mysterious lottery money coming from the sky and you get to go spend it. But then you think, well, every money's got its plus and minuses. And with lottery, it's that people often assume you have a lot more money than you do, and then they look for ways to spend it for you.